And thanks to the Occupational Health Center for inviting me today, and everyone who made the time to attend. Before I begin, I should just say that I'm coming to you today from Kingston, Ontario, or the Kingston area, which is the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Wendat peoples. So it's great to be with you to talk about AI and what workers can do to protect themselves from some of its more negative social consequences. I think that this is a topic that's on a lot of people's minds, so it's great to get together and talk about it. I'll first begin by just briefly outlining what I plan to do in the talk. I want to start by framing the discussion by offering some comments about the relationship between technology, generally speaking, and capitalism. And here I'll just do a bit of a shameless self-promotion. Here I'm drawing on a chapter from my book with Mark Thomas, which is called Work and Labor in Canada: Critical Issues. Chapter 10 in it has more on this topic if you're interested in reading it. Second, I'll review some of the claims about AI's impacts on jobs. And here I'm quite skeptical about some of the claims that AI is revolutionizing the labor market. I really don't see a lot of evidence for this, and I'll run through that for both Canada and elsewhere. Next, I'm going to look at what businesses are actually doing with AI so far, and following this, some of the troubling speculative investment in AI and its infrastructure. I'm going to suggest that if there's a job threat that's coming from AI, it's because of this in speculative investment risk that's driving the economy into a potential recession, not because of algorithms replacing workers. And the last thing I want to do is review some of the ways that workers and the public can intervene to regulate AI. Just because the technology isn't currently having the types of widespread impacts on jobs that many people are claiming, that doesn't mean that workers shouldn't be equipped to address its potential impacts down the road. And so I'll look at a couple of examples from other jurisdictions that we might draw from and learn from. So, to start, I mean, technology, generally speaking, has always been a central feature of capitalism. I mean, to put it simply, technology is a tool or a set of tools. What's unique about the use of technology under capitalism is that employers, pursuing their own profit maximization, make decisions about how tech will be used and deployed. But even employers don't make those decisions under circumstances of their own choosing, of course. It's competition between firms that drives them to deploy technology in order to remain competitive. So it's really the dynamics of capitalism that drives the use and abuse of technology. The battle between workers and bosses has always been about how technology will be used and how the benefits of technology will be distributed. Technology raises the productivity of labor, and in the process, it increases the relative amount of surplus that's extracted from workers from their bosses. In plain terms, technology increases the amount of stuff that workers can produce in a given unit of time, hence the struggle over the distribution of its fruits. This changes the composition of tasks that make up specific jobs, and it therefore rearranges how employers deploy labor, both within particular firms and across the entire economy. So technology has this revolutionizing impact on workers by rearranging the tasks that compose jobs. This can be highly disruptive for many workers, particularly if it means that firms in your local economy, for example, now need fewer workers to produce more stuff. Whether or not that decreases or increases the aggregate number of jobs in the economy is a separate question, but locally it can be quite disruptive. So, deindustrialization in the manufacturing industry or in resource extraction, for example, offer particularly galling examples of how disruptive this can be for particular communities that are impacted by industrial job loss. But technology can also have positive impacts on workers. By raising the productivity of labor, workers can bargain up their wages. The more value they produce, the more potential there is to raise wages and standards of living. But that process is not automatic, as some economists would suggest. So it's not just a matter of raising productivity, and that automatically means that workers are better off. For example, the massive productivity gains of the mid 20th century translated into rising working class living standards because of a combination both of productivity enhancing technology and mass industrial unionization. Productivity gains created the material opportunity to raise working class wages and prosperity, but collective bargaining ensured that that actually happened. In countries such as Sweden or Germany, highly organized and centralized labor movements were often some of the biggest boosters of productive investment. They purposefully bargained their wages very high and set a standard as part of a grand bargain with employers to raise labor productivity, particularly in export-driven sectors of the economy. More recently, though, as advanced economies have become more service-oriented, that is, as they've deindustrialized, this process of raising worker productivity and hence living standards has largely broken down because it's much more difficult to introduce labor-enhancing technologies into service sector jobs, much harder than it is in traditional manufacturing. There's only so much there's only so much faster that you can care for a sick patient or ring a customer's groceries through. It's not the same. It's not as conducive to technology as mass industry is. And as a result, productivity growth has slowed in our service-based economy, and labor incomes have stagnated and also polarized. So workers in the upper tier of the service sector with higher education and professional credentials can often command well above working class incomes, while those in the lower rungs of the labor market experience very low and often stagnant pay. Moreover, it's been very difficult for unions to make any inroads into that lower rung of the service economy, dominated as it is often by small firms and franchised and fissured workplaces. So indeed, wage polarization is now a central feature of our low productivity service economy. So what's new about AI? So while mechanization and automation have always been central features of the capitalist labor process, there are aspects of AI that may be unique. So one feature of the previous wave of technological change and automation that may intensify has to do with that labor market polarization that I was speaking about before. So AI, if some of its more speculative and infant technological advancements become generalizable, may supercharge that process of polarization. By mimicking human activities such as speech and mental processing, AI could have the potential to de-skill some of those workers who were previously protected in the upper rungs of the service economy, protected because they had special intellectual labor skills or professional credentials. In this sense, credentialed intellectual workers who previously enjoyed higher individual bargaining power in the labor market may find themselves in a worse position than they previously were because of AI's capabilities. And this, I think, is where much of the worry about AI is actually stemming from, is that a set of workers who were previously, if not immune, then better protected from technological de-skilling are suddenly more vulnerable. But even here, the evidence is mixed at best, I think, at this stage, as I'll review later in the presentation. For other workers, the primary worry is not that AI will displace them, but that it will allow employers to further degrade their jobs through work intensification, really invasive forms of surveillance, and atomization from other workers. So, for example, algorithmic management comes to mind as a particularly dystopian example of this. Workers who are sort of regulated or have their work regulated by a seemingly faceless algorithm. In fact, I think the primary hope among many employers is not that AI will rid them of workers necessarily, but that it'll allow them to extract further surplus out of those workers to solve the problem of our perpetually low productivity service economy. And on this, I think that they're likely to be proven wrong, but they may gain some advantages, particularly when it comes to work intensification and surveillance. If you listen to some tech CEOs, you might imagine that we're on the cusp of a jobs apocalypse. So the CEO of Anthropic has referred to AI's impact on white-collar jobs as a bloodbath, suggesting that AI could, quote, wipe out nearly half of all entry-level white-collar jobs and spike unemployment to 10 or 20% within the next 5 years. Similar alarmist takes have often proliferated since at least the mid 2010s about automation previously, and more recently about AI specifically. Yet, study after study finds no such impact. For example, a study recently published by Yale's Budget Lab found widespread anxiety over AI among workers, but no actual relationship between AI adoption and employment or unemployment. So it had no impact whatsoever on the level of employment or the level of unemployment. The authors of that study note that while the mix of occupations across the economy has been changing slightly more quickly than it has in previous decades, that's a trend that actually predates AI, and AI seems to be having no noticeable impact on it. The Nobel-winning economist Darren Asamoglu, in a recent paper examining AI's potential impacts on GDP growth, is even more skeptical. In that paper, he estimates a modest 1.5% GDP growth attributable to AI over an entire decade. So not year on year, that's over an entire decade. While some AI tools are amazingly impressive, so for example, large language models' ability to distill and summarize large amounts of text-based data, their capabilities and reliability remain wanting in many cases. So AI may be great at helping students cheat on their final term papers, but it doesn't seem particularly good thus far at raising worker productivity and generating the promised corporate profits. And recall the thesis that I began the presentation with. Technology doesn't replace human labor, it augments and rearranges it. And so far, AI seems to be doing very little of that. This has been true, this relationship between technology and labor, throughout the history of capitalism. Whether technology de-skills or upskills workers is a question of technology's application and the balance of power between workers and employers. And this is every bit as much the challenge with AI. As some of the data that I'm going to run through in this section shows, the supposed productivity promises of AI are premature at best and may be entirely dubious. So a little bit about where the labor market in Canada currently sits. In general, Canada's labor market is still relatively robust, though it's softened somewhat from the immediate post-pandemic years. So following the lockdown period of the pandemic, when the economy reopened, employment rebounded remarkably quickly, the fastest that it has in any post-recession economic recovery. Buoyed by strong government supports and spending during the lockdown, unemployment reached historic lows and wage growth was quite healthy. However, we know the next phase of that story. Inflation began to bite into workers' real wages. The Bank of Canada then started a cycle of interest rate increases to squeeze inflation out of the economy. The government reined in spending, that's at the federal and provincial levels. And as the economy began to cool, unemployment again creeped up and wage growth moderated. So since about mid 2023, the labor market has basically been treading water. And in this context, it's difficult to square the claims about AI's supposed revolutionary impact with these, lackluster job numbers. So in this graph here, I'm reporting the official unemployment rate and the R8 unemployment rate, which takes into consideration people who are in part-time work involuntarily, people who are laid off and waiting to be recalled, and other discouraged workers who haven't been looking for work. And so what you notice is that unemployment has remained relatively low, even though it's crept up from about mid 2023, still relatively robust. And that includes for those who are in the R8 count, which remains closer to the unemployment count than it has in most of the pre-pandemic years. So at the macro level in Canada, AI is having no discernible negative impact on jobs in this country or elsewhere for that matter. There's been plenty of anecdotal stories about firms shedding workers or freezing new hiring, but there's simply no discernible AI impact when it comes to employment or unemployment overall. In fact, if one takes into account the construction of infrastructure that's related to AI, it actually may be creating more jobs in the aggregate than it's destroying. But given the speculative nature of AI investment, that's likely to turn out to not be a good thing either, but I'll discuss that later. Nevertheless, there has been a weakening in hiring now for some time, but again, this likely has little to do with AI and much more to do with a general slowdown in the economy, particularly under the pressure and uncertainty that's been caused by Trump's trade war. So let's take a look at what companies are actually doing or how many of them are actually deploying AI. So using occupational data from the 2021 census, StatCan researchers recently attempted to quantify what they call AI exposure. That is, workers, whether or not they're exposed or use AI in their jobs. So according to their figures, roughly 3 in 5 workers are in a job with some exposure, potential exposure to AI. But what that actually means in practice is less clear. According to StatCan's survey on business conditions, the share of companies reporting AI use grew from 6.1% in the second quarter of 2024 to 12.2% in the second quarter of 2025, so doubling in a year. Firms in cultural industries, business and professional services, and finance and insurance were the most likely to have adopted AI so far. As I mentioned at the beginning, white collar workers seem to be most exposed. But in retail and wholesale trade, accommodation and food services, and transport and warehousing, where the vast majority of lower paid service sector workers are concentrated, this is really where the working class is concentrated in the Canadian economy. AI adoption is barely noticeable all under 2%. What are employers actually doing with this technology? So a look at StatCan's data helps to clarify this. And this is a table that I pulled directly from their latest survey on business conditions. So the primary reported use of AI is text analytics. And this is basically processing and summarizing large volumes of text-based information, such as customer reviews, for example. And this has grown over the past year from 25% of surveyed firms to nearly 36% of surveyed firms. Data analytics, so roughly doing the same thing but with numbers, is right behind, but only having grown a little bit, around a percentage point. What's noticeable is that in many areas, AI use has actually fallen over the past year. So the use of chatbots for customer service is down, largely because customers hate them and because actual human beings have to sort out the problems that they create often. Use of machine learning is down, as is image and pattern recognition, largely because these technologies are often inferior to actual human cognition. And crucially, however, the vast majority of business surveyed by StatCan who indicated the use of AI reported no change in their employee headcount. So that's nearly 90% of firms. And this was actually up from the previous year when just under 85% of firms said that AI had no impact on the number of employees that they retained. Instead, what most firms reported, over nearly half, is that AI was changing what they call their workflow, which basically just means that workers' tasks are being rearranged. Now, whether that means that they're more or less skilled or the work is more or less fulfilling is a separate question, but that's largely the story. Moreover, despite growing AI adoption in Canada, there seems to be no notable difference in productivity growth so far, which of course is supposed to be the great promise of AI. Low productivity growth has been a persistent problem in Canada's economy for a long time, with business leaders and economists routinely complaining about it. In part, the explanation for this comparatively low business investment in research and development in Canada, as well as low capital spending and very low spending on worker training. Actually, Canadian employers are, comparatively speaking, quite negligent when it comes to spending on worker training. We spend some of the lowest in the OECD. While productivity growth has improved marginally recently, that growth has been mostly in goods production, so industries where AI adoption is actually very low or non-existent. In other words, the growth in unit labor output that we've seen recently has largely been in the old-fashioned industries where workers actually make physical things. Yet there are some, for example, the Conference Board of Canada, who suggest that the reason for this may be skepticism and fear, both on the part of workers and employers, that's holding back the productivity gains of AI. Workers fear AI's immediate impacts on their jobs. Employers, on the other hand, may be risk averse and unsure if the high costs of investment will pay off. As I'll show later, I think we may be thankful for that hesitancy down the road. The hype around AI may also be driving down worker satisfaction, however. Scott Scheiman, Paul Glavin, and Alexander Wilson at the University of Toronto recently conducted a representative sample of 2,519 Canadian workers for their ongoing Canadian Quality of Work and Economic Life study, and the findings were interesting. Feelings about the potential impacts of AI were mixed. Only about 16% of surveyed workers said that mass job loss was likely, while 36% said that it was not likely or not likely at all. However, 67% of respondents, so over a third, believed that employers expected loyalty from workers but didn't show any in return. This was especially the case when it came to the deployment of technology. Workers were even more likely to feel that this feeling of lack of loyalty and disposability was prominent among their coworkers. So in other words, they think that the coworkers are equally or even more dissatisfied than themselves. In other words, it seems that AI hype may be driving a feeling of disposability, as the author said, among workers, which was particularly evident among low-level and new hired workers in the tech industry. So despite a growing number of Canadian firms indicating that they're adopting AI or integrating it into their work processes, the overall take-up is still relatively low, though the hype around AI may be driving worker dissatisfaction and increasing antagonisms between workers and employers. So, as I mentioned, I think at this stage, the real threat actually comes not from AI as a technology, but the speculative investment that's driving its paper wealth. So if AI adoption is relatively limited and its impact on jobs so far, I think, is basically negligible, there is one place where AI is making a big splash, and that's in the realm of investment. In 2025 alone, companies connected to AI accounted for 80% of all stock gains. As one commentator put it, the US has become one big bet on AI. As Jim Stanford noted in an excellent op-ed in the Toronto Star this past weekend, the so-called Magnificent Seven, that's Alphabet, Amazon, Apple, Meta, Microsoft, Nvidia, and Tesla, are now valued at a collective $20 trillion US, accounting for 35% of the entire S&P 500. Yet much of this is simply paper wealth. It's unrelated to the actual revenues of any of these companies. In fact, no major AI consumer or business service is currently profitable. The biggest players in the game, such as OpenAI, which operates ChatGPT, are heavily indebted. A recent MIT published study from this summer, which I've noted here and I've also linked at the end of this presentation, is particularly instructive. While the authors tracked 30 to 40 billion in US enterprise level AI investment, the widespread adoption of services like ChatGPT and Microsoft Copilot, 95% of firms reported zero positive return on those investments, which is remarkable. So we're living in a bubble characterized by highly overvalued stocks tied to AI. Investors have gone all in on the potential of AI to deliver productivity and growth unseen in human history. But the discrepancy between the stock prices and the book values of these companies has grown to roughly 17% larger than it was during the 2000 dot-com frenzy prior to that economic crash, and by some estimates, roughly 4 times the size that the discrepancy was before the 2008 financial crisis. So this investment frenzy in the US is basically holding up the economy. From data centers to electrical infrastructure to semiconductor manufacturing, by some estimates, roughly half of GDP growth in the US was accounted for last year by AI-related investment. If or when that bet collapses, it may mean economic pain for a lot of people, workers included. that Canada has not gone in as heavily on AI investment is a positive thing. Many business commentators are bemoaning Canada's lack of investment in these technologies, but when the house of cards eventually falls, we'll be happy that we didn't. And there may already be signs that the chickens are coming home to roost. So, for example, there have been growing numbers of layoffs in the tech sector, particularly in the US. Unsurprisingly, AI boasters have claimed these as proof that AI is working, that is, that it's displacing workers. Yet, other commentators point out these layoffs appear to have much more to do with cost cutting at heavily indebted companies than with any productivity gains related to AI. Canada may be shielded somewhat from this fallout, though not entirely, given how integrated we still remain with the United States despite the tariff war. There's also evidence that starting salaries in some professional roles, such as consultancy, have declined. Yet again, it's unclear that AI is driving this. It may rather be that general labor market stagnation and firm indebtedness are the driving factors, and that AI is just the public justification for these layoffs. And there are also further signs that the labor market is softening in tech adjacent firms. So, for example, job changing, which is typically a sign of worker confidence and a robust labor market, has slowed to a snail's pace recently. With a murky economic outlook, fewer workers are changing jobs and pursuing new opportunities. On average, only 0.4% of Canadian workers changed employers in the third quarter of 2025, down from 0.7 in 2029, according to Statistics Canada. So to me, this suggests that there's plenty to be skeptical about when it comes to AI, um, particularly when it comes to its impacts on workers in the labor market. And so I'm just going to run through a couple of slides here quickly to demonstrate sort of the discrepancy between investment and actual impacts of AI so far. So these next several slides are taken from Stanford University's Artificial Intelligence Index report for 2025, which I've also linked at the end of this presentation, along with a few other resources that people might find helpful. This first reports global corporate investment in AI, breaking it down by type. So mergers and acquisitions, minority stakes in existing firms, private investment, and initial public offerings. So what we see is a massive growth in 2020 and 2021, then a slight cooling off as interest rates increased. But AI investment is still driving economic investment overall. And the same is true with private investment. So this is investment in non-publicly traded firms. Um, Again, it's not simply stock overvaluation that's going to the publicly traded firms, but also to privately held corporations. So the spread of really kind of risky investment is true across the economy. Yet when you look at the number of applications, this looks at robots installed by type, we see that collaborative, that's the pink box at the bottom, robots which involve AI are still a very small share of the total. So they've grown since 2020, but it's still a very small share for the most part. We're still talking about automation, not talking about AI as a widespread technology in the manufacturing process. So I said I wanted to close by looking at some of the regulatory responses to AI that I think are instructive and helpful. Though I think the current AI hype warrants a healthy dose of skepticism, that doesn't necessarily mean that we should be ill-prepared. The history of capitalism provides plenty of examples of technologies being deployed in ways that have been harmful to workers, their livelihoods, and their health, as well as to society more broadly. And AI is likely to be no different. We're already seeing signs of that, of course. And it's all the more reason to equip ourselves with the tools to respond. So I'm breaking these into two categories, collective bargaining and public regulation. And so we'll start with collective bargaining. The primary mechanisms for workers to fight back against abusive uses of AI is through unionization and the collective bargaining process. And toward that end, many unions have produced helpful guides concerning bargaining over technological change and the adoption of AI. So the AFL-CIO in the United States, which is the National Labor Federation there, recently released a report on the principles of protecting workers from AI, which highlights the ways to give workers greater voice over AI at both the level of the workplace and at the level of society. The Canadian Labour Congress has also produced a research report on automation and AI. And then I've included a few examples here, which again are also linked at the end of the presentation. Unifor's report, The Future of Work is Ours, Confronting Risks and Seizing Opportunities of Technological Change, is very insightful. The Machinists Union as well has produced a helpful report called Charting Change, Workers' Voices in an Automated World. Perhaps the best general study was produced by Jim Stanford and Kathy Bennett at the Center for Future Work. In this study called Bargaining Tech, Strategies for Shaping Technological Change to Benefit Workers, Stanford and Bennett review collective agreements from across the country to identify provisions that address technological change. And they highlight 350 such provisions in areas like requirements for notice and consultation over technological change, job security provisions, rights to severance pay and other compensation, training requirements, occupational health and safety protections, and work from home and hybrid work rights. So across a variety of contract provisions, which is a really helpful resource for unions heading into bargaining and thinking about how they might respond to technological change generally, but to AI in particular. And the review of these studies demonstrates that when it comes to technologies, unions have long been engaged. The question then becomes, to what degree will AI be different? And perhaps more importantly, how can we get more workers into unions to extend them the benefits of collective bargaining and to ensure that they have input over the way that tech impacts their lives and their work? So there isn't time to go into this in detail, but I think one area that's deserving of deeper consideration is sectoral bargaining. With private sector union density at only 15%, we need legislative reform to extend unionization and collective bargaining to greater numbers of workers. Otherwise, we leave them on their own with no other mechanism for collective voice in the workplace. So now I want to talk about legislative responses. As many now recognize the potential of AI to be highly disruptive across many areas of social life warrants legislative intervention. So here I'm going to focus on work and employment, though of course other areas of politics, the environment, social questions also deserve attention. One area where AI is in fact touching the world of work in very troubling ways is hiring. And you should know that this is actually poorly captured in a lot of the firm-based surveys that I was reviewing before, because they're concerned with what firms are doing, like their workflow and so on, not about their hiring processes. One study in the United States indicates that upwards of 87% of firms used AI at some stage in the hiring process last year. Typically, that's at an early stage to sort through applications, yet video recording technology is also being used to evaluate candidates' interview performances, and other text-based systems are being used to evaluate written components. And these tools have produced innumerable accusations of bias, including racial and gender discrimination. In part, this is explained by the design of these programs and who designs them, but also because they're trained on previously successful applications and candidates. So in a labor market that's already stratified along lines of race and gender, the AI tool will simply reproduce that bias. In 2024, the European Union passed the Artificial Intelligence Act, which classifies any AI used in hiring as, quote, high risk, and that triggers a host of transparency requirements and limitations on its use. So developers of these technologies are required to document how their AI is built and trained so that public regulators can audit it for bias. And these obligations then apply both to the creators of the AI technology as well as the companies who contract to use it. Beyond defining obligations, the Act also provides for enforcement. So EU member states are required to designate a single national supervisory authority that's responsible then for monitoring compliance with the law and coordinating oversight across the European bloc. Developers are also required to affix a certification label that signals compliance with EU standards to all business customers. So this is sort of like creating a standard like you would for I recently installed a ceiling fan in my office, and it has a safety standard on it. Same idea. It would have to be certified as free of bias. Most importantly, this act has real teeth. Developers and employers who fail to comply or take the necessary corrective actions can be fined up to 35 million euros or 7% of their global annual revenue. And the act also operates in tandem with other laws like the General Data Protection Regulation in the EU, which guarantees the individuals the right not to be subject, quote, to any decision solely based on automated processing. In California as well this summer, they passed amendments to their Fair Employment and Housing Act to address the use of AI in hiring as well as rental leasing. And the new amendments prohibit the use of AI that discriminates on the basis of any protected category in the act. So that includes race, gender, national origin, sex, disability, religion, or pregnancy. And the law imposes record-keeping requirements to allow regulators to investigate allegations of noncompliance. So these are just a couple of examples, and provinces in Canada could undertake similar legislative efforts under human rights codes or under employment standards, which is what I'm going to talk about to finish. Sorry, it's too soon. Many of them, because the majority of workers in Canada are not union members, we need strong protections that are adopted through employment standards, as well as occupational health and safety laws and human rights codes. We also, of course, need to address the misclassification of gig and other workers that are denied employment law protections. Again, here, California offers an interesting example. In 2021, the state passed Assembly Bill 701, better known as the Warehouse Quotas Law. So under this law, workplaces classified as warehouses are required to disclose to government regulators as well as to workers how they use algorithms to organize the work, how they track worker productivity, and how they develop the quotas. So the law, of course, was prompted by Amazon's brutal treatment of its workers and in recognition of Amazon's impact on the warehousing sector more broadly. After this, New York and Washington state both passed laws along similar lines. Overall, the laws are meant to prevent employers from designing workplace quotas or structuring the flow of work in ways that infringe on workers' rights to statutory breaks or other rest periods. Though the law is narrowly focused, we could pursue similar transparency laws that are applicable to workplaces more generally. The issue, of course, is that transparency requirements don't necessarily address how companies use technology to drive the pace of work. They might limit it to some degree, but they don't get to the root of it. But by forcing them to disclose that information, it at least lays the basis for workers to organize a response. So I would say that we need to review our employment standards laws in Manitoba, but also in provinces across the country to begin to address technological change in similar ways. If the primary impact of AI for most workers will be intensification of their work and increasingly invasive surveillance on the job, we need public regulations that address this issue and that don't exclude any workers in the process. Thanks so much. And again, here are the list of resources that I mentioned, so we can share the slides and they're available to anyone.
Thank you, Dr. King. You provide us with really, really great, interesting information. We all learn a lot from you. We got questions from Dorothy, but she has to take off earlier for another meetings. So her question is what about the stress of having AI used in someone's workplaces or job? And related concern about the effect on their jobs. What do you think about that?
So the question was about the stress of having AI used in someone's workplace related concerns. I mean, yeah, I mean, this sort of gets to sort of what I ended with there. I think that the concern a lot of the time right now is that people are often unaware of if AI is being used or even how it's being used. So I think the place to start, in fact, is around some of these issues of transparency, particularly, when workers are not unionized and there isn't a duty to negotiate over these things on the part of employers. What we really need to start with actually is better disclosure around how these technologies are actually being used, so that workers can begin to mount a response and actually have some sort of impact on how these things are being used.
Another question I make is coming from me is um, on your slide, you're talking about 3 in 5 workers has been AI exposed, at the workplaces, right? So you mentioned about the employment standard or the act, the regulations should do something to kind of lay out more regulations on that, how to protecting workers in using AI. So do you think at the workplace themselves, they should have their own policy how to use AI at the workplaces, and what should be including in the policy from your perspective?
I mean, that's a good question. And I should
Mhm.
just clarify that the statistic on AI exposure is also
Yeah.
somewhat speculative. So it's
Mhm.
jobs that could potentially be impacted. So that's
Yeah.
3 in 5 is
Yeah.
quite high. So it's
Mhm.
somewhat forward looking. It's not workers that were exposed yesterday. But again, I would go back to that. Most of these right now, I mean, the obligations on employers to actually disclose these things on workers are virtually none. So that's, I think, where we have to start is some open and frank conversations about these things. And I think not even just at the level of the workplace, but of course at the level of government as well. Um, Government has been very resistant to having labor as a partner in the discussion around AI at all. I mean, it's mostly been business leaders and technical experts on these things. Roundtables and other consultative processes that have been convened at the federal level have entirely excluded the labor movement. In fact, the studies that came out or that unions were producing around 21, 22 were largely a response to that actually being excluded from those government consultations and not having a seat at the table, and workers' voices really being ignored. And so I think that's still the stage that we're in right now, is trying to kind of create pressure to get workers a seat at the table for these discussions and to actually coalesce labor around a particular set of demands. And to my mind, that starts with transparency, but it also has to do with job protections, occupational health and safety protections, and those types of things. But I think we're still really in the early stages of developing a kind of coherent labor response to this stuff.
Thank you. This is another question on the chat. Lots of experts are talking about the AI bubble. Do you think about the bubble will burst soon, or is it the years away?
If I knew the answer to that, I could potentially make a lot of money. I don't have a crystal ball or even a good timeline, I think, of when that bubble will burst, but I think there's no question that it is a bubble, that the paper values of most of these companies are unrelated to their performance. This has been true of some of the quote unquote magnificent seven for some time, like Tesla. When you compare Tesla to other auto manufacturers, the difference between its stock value and its annual revenues, it doesn't even look like a car company at all. And of course, it would probably say it's a tech company, but it's just one example that this has been a problem for some time. But the problem is getting much, much worse with these tech companies, and they're betting on big payoffs from AI, but I just don't see any evidence that that's going to be the case. And particularly if they're hanging their hat on the potential productivity gains to be had by AI. I mean, we've been living through a kind of living in a low productivity economy for some time since we shift to to a service-based economy. And I don't see that changing anytime soon. I don't think that AI is going to be the technological breakthrough that suddenly changes that long-term trajectory.
Yeah. And then another question is about the AI related workplace risk be formally recognized within occupational health and safety frameworks. So, what do you think about that?
Yeah, this is challenging really because, you know, the way that we tackle most labor regulation in Canada, we leave the organization of the workplace and the determination of how work takes place to management as a management right. Even in unionized workplaces, you can bargain over certain things, but as every union negotiator knows, management has a right to organize the workplace as they see fit to a large degree, and that's even more the case, of course, in non-unionized workplaces. And so we have a real problem here when it comes to um, work intensification, like how we address that. The primary ways that we address that, of course, is the regulation of working time in employment standards. So we have, legislated breaks and legislated rest periods between shifts, those types of things, and then occupational health and safety that, the pace of work is not supposed to be backbreaking. There's certain limitations on how we protect workers' health and safety that way. But there are major gaps there because of the fact that we allow management the right to organize the workplace. And so I think that overall AI is going to force us to kind of rethink that in ways. And I think really the only way through that is through unionization and collective bargaining over technology's uses, right? I mean, Stanford and Bennett's report is a good example of this, and there are some examples in there of creative ways to use occupational health and safety as a way to mitigate the intensification impacts from technology. But for non-union workers, I think there's a lot of creative thinking that we still need to do.
You're right. So, there's no more questions on the chat. We may be waiting, give folks another couple of minutes. So yeah, as we said, the session has been recorded, and also Dr. King, we willing to share the slide as well. Then I'm going to send it to you with the recorded link and the slide when they are all available. So okay, this is another one coming up. Talking about the federal employees, the FIPA, provincial employees have the PIPA, I don't know how to pronounce it, all what kind of the online privacy protection do private sector employees have? And is there anything private sector employees can do to push for protections?
Hmm. That's an interesting question. Thanks, Alexis, for that question. I have to confess, that's not an area that I know a lot about privacy protections and how they operate in the workplace. So unfortunately I can't comment on that, but I certainly take your point that it's an area of importance. And I think maybe some of the stuff that I was talking about concerning hiring and rules around um, AI's use in hiring from other jurisdictions might be a place to look and think about privacy protections. But yeah, not an area that I'm super familiar with.
Yeah, okay. So if we don't have any more questions, then we'll be going to wrap up the session here. Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. King, to doing such a great presentation for us, to sharing all your interesting information and then that resources. This is a really, really good material for us to learn. Happy holiday for all of you. So then have a really wonderful time and relaxing and peaceful, enjoying time with your families and loved ones. So we will see everyone in the new year. Thank you so much again, and thank you for all your participation. Okay, bye
Thank you.
bye.